order did not arrive wrapped in urgency or fear. It was delivered with certainty, reinforced by tradition, and backed by the full authority of command. Flags were raised, horns sounded, runners shouted confirmations down the decks. Every captain understood what was required of him, and every sailor understood what obedience meant. The fleet was to remain in formation, maintain alignment, and hold position relative to the ships around it, regardless of conditions. In the ancient world, such an order was considered the foundation of naval survival. Formation was not merely a tactical preference, it was the core principle around which entire fleets were trained to function. To abandon formation was to invite confusion, collision, and defeat. A fleet that broke apart lost its cohesion, its discipline, and its ability to act as a single force. Commanders feared that loss more than almost anything else. What they feared less, fatally, was the sea itself. Ancient warships were built for confrontation, not endurance. Their long, narrow hulls were optimized for speed and maneuverability in controlled conditions, where oars could strike water in unison and helms could respond precisely to commands. These vessels were low to the surface, lightly framed, and structurally vulnerable when exposed to heavy seas. Their strength lay in coordinated movement, not independent resilience. When the water behaved as expected, a fleet in formation became a weapon of immense power. When it did not, that same formation became a constraint that magnified every danger. The Mediterranean was not a gentle sea. Its storms formed quickly and often without warning, driven by shifting winds that could turn calm waters into violent chaos in a matter of hours. Experienced maritime cultures understood these patterns. They respected seasonal limits, adjusted routes to weather conditions, and allowed individual captains discretion when the sea demanded it. Rome, still new to naval warfare during the early centuries of its expansion, believed discipline could compensate for experience. That belief was tested repeatedly and catastrophically. When a storm began to build around a fleet ordered to hold formation, the first signs of danger were subtle. Winds stiffened, pressing unevenly against sails and hulls. Waves grew irregular, striking ships at slightly different angles. Oars began to lose synchronization as water resistance varied from one stroke to the next. These small disruptions mattered enormously. Ancient warships depended on precise timing and balance. Even minor deviations strained rowers and steering crews. As conditions worsened, ships that should have been adjusting independently were instead locked into relative positions that no longer matched the movement of the sea. A vessel lifted by a wave surged forward, while its neighbor lagged behind, creating dangerous compression within the line. Hulls brushed against one another. Oars collided and snapped. Steering oars, already under strain, were wrenched violently, sometimes tearing free from their mountings. Once a ship lost effective steering, it became a hazard to every vessel around it. The order remained unchanged. Captains could see what was happening. They felt it in the resistance of the helm, in the way their ships responded sluggishly or unpredictably. Veteran sailors sensed the growing instability beneath their feet, the unnatural motion that signaled a sea no longer willing to cooperate. Under different circumstances, they would have altered course, loosened spacing, or sought open water where waves could be met head-on. Under orders to maintain formation, they did none of these things. The fleet pressed on as a single body, even as that body began to break apart internally. Once collisions began, damage multiplied rapidly. Ancient hulls were constructed of wooden planking joined by mortise and tenon joints, strong under normal conditions but vulnerable to repeated impacts. A single collision could loosen seams, allowing water to seep in. Repeated impacts widened those gaps, increasing the inflow. Hand pumps, worked frantically by exhausted crews, could not keep pace. As water accumulated, ships rode lower, making them even more susceptible to waves washing over the deck. Lower decks flooded first, Rowers, packed tightly and unable to see what was happening above, suddenly found cold seawater rushing around their legs. Panic spread quickly in these confined spaces. Commands became harder to hear. Rhythm collapsed. As rowing faltered, ships lost what little maneuverability they retained, drifting even more dangerously among their neighbors. The formation, once a symbol of order, had become a mechanism of destruction. When the fleet sailed near land, the consequences were even worse. Storm-driven waves pushed ships sideways toward rocky coastlines, shoals, and reefs. Normally, captains would have turned away early, sacrificing alignment to preserve their vessels. Under orders to hold formation, hesitation proved fatal. Ships could not all turn simultaneously without colliding. Delay meant drift, and drift meant grounding. Grounded ships died quickly. Hulls slammed against rocks with relentless force. Planking shattered. Keels cracked. Water rushed in uncontrollably. Men trapped below decks had no chance to escape. Those who reached the surface often found themselves swept back against wreckage or crushed between ships driven ashore together. Entire crews vanished within minutes. Ancient sources describe coastlines littered with debris for miles after such disasters. Broken oars, fragments of hulls, shields, helmets, and bodies washed ashore long after the storm passed. Survivors were rare, and those who lived carried memories that haunted them for the rest of their lives. They spoke not of enemy fleets or heroic resistance, but of helplessness in the face of an order that denied them the ability to save themselves. One of the most devastating examples occurred during the First Punic War, when Roman fleets operating off Sicily and North Africa were repeatedly destroyed by storms following rigid command decisions. In one instance, after a successful campaign, a Roman commander ordered his fleet to sail despite clear signs of deteriorating weather and the approach of an unfavorable season. The ships stayed tightly grouped as conditions worsened, adhering to doctrine rather than adapting to reality. When the storm struck in full force, the fleet had nowhere to go. Ships were driven ashore en masse, smashed together, or overwhelmed by waves that poured over their low sides. Ancient historians estimate that tens of thousands of men were lost, along with hundreds of ships, without a single enemy vessel involved. It was one of the greatest naval disasters of the ancient world, and it was caused not by ignorance of danger, but by obedience to an inflexible order. The psychological impact of these events cannot be overstated. Sailors understood the sea. They respected it, feared it, and knew its moods. To be forced by command to ignore that knowledge created a deep and lasting tension aboard ancient ships. Discipline demanded obedience, but experience whispered warnings that could not be acted upon. Men learned that survival sometimes depended less on skill or courage than on whether their commander understood when to loosen his grip on control. Over time, Rome adapted. Hard lessons forced changes in naval doctrine. Seasonal sailing limits were observed more carefully. Formations were loosened in rough conditions. Greater discretion was granted to individual captains. These reforms saved lives, but they came only after repeated catastrophes had demonstrated the cost of inflexible command. The order to hold formation was deadly precisely because it made sense. It reflected a worldview that valued unity, discipline, and control above all else. On land, those values built empires. At sea, they collided with a force that could not be commanded, threatened, or reasoned with. The sea did not care about hierarchy or intent. It responded only to physics, pressure, and movement. When ancient fleets were ordered to ignore those realities, the outcome followed a grim pattern. Ships damaged each other. Steering failed. Water flooded in. Panic spread. Men drowned. And afterward, the sea erased the evidence with the same indifference it had shown during the disaster itself. This is why the deadliest orders at sea were not always shouted in rage or desperation. They were spoken calmly, issued confidently, and obeyed perfectly. They were orders that placed faith in discipline where adaptability was required, and certainty where humility was needed. For the men who died because of them, obedience was absolute, and survival was not. The sea accepted them all the same. The survivors of the first wave of destruction were few, and they quickly learned that the water itself was a more relentless adversary than any enemy ship. In the chaos that followed the initial disaster, those still alive found themselves cast into a world entirely divorced from the order and discipline that had governed life aboard the fleet. Above, ships continued to struggle in the storm, but below, the rules of naval engagement no longer applied. The sea did not negotiate. It did not wait for men to recover their strength. It demanded obedience of a different kind, endurance, instinct, and an almost unimaginable capacity to fight the pull of waves, wind, and fatigue. For those who had plunged overboard, the first moments were a brutal reckoning. Cold water struck without warning, slamming into the chest, searing the lungs with shock. Even in the relatively temperate waters of the Mediterranean, sudden immersion caused involuntary gasps that often dragged seawater into the lungs before the body could respond. Muscles tensed, locking in resistance to a force they could not control. The mind, accustomed to the structured environment of the ship's deck, struggled to comprehend the absence of a solid plane beneath the feet. The horizon wavered as waves tossed the body, light refracted and scattered across rolling surfaces, and sound was muffled into a low, incomprehensible roar. It was disorienting, terrifying, and merciless. Few sailors were prepared for the way armor and equipment compounded the struggle. Helmets, once a source of protection from projectiles, filled with water and pulled the head backward, straining the neck and threatening to drag the lungs under. Cloaks and tunics, soaked instantly, became heavy nets wrapping around arms and legs, reducing mobility and making every stroke an act of extraordinary effort. Leather straps and belts absorbed water, tightening with each wave, constricting movement and sapping energy. Shields that had once defended the body from spears and arrows now acted as anchors, dragging the sailor downward with every attempt to swim. Swords, unwieldy and heavy when dry, became near impossibilities in the churning water, catching on loose clothing, oars, or debris. Every tool and weapon designed to preserve life on deck became a potential instrument of death once the man entered the water. As the first few minutes passed, the initial shock gave way to exhaustion. A rower or marine trained in months or years of drills could withstand the cold, maintain buoyancy, and stroke effectively for a limited period. But the storm and the battle conditions combined to make even the strongest struggle futile. The surface of the water was a chaotic mass of foam, broken timber, and discarded equipment. Waves crashed unpredictably, lifting one sailor only to throw him into another, disorienting him further. Salt water stung the eyes and mouth, burning open wounds inflicted in the first moments of the crash or during collisions with other vessels. Every stroke expended precious energy, and with each passing minute, the probability of survival decreased. The psychological dimension of these moments was just as lethal. Sailors were trained to act collectively, to trust their position within the formation, to follow orders instantly and without question. In the water, these rules no longer applied. Isolation was absolute. The nearest ship, once a source of coordination and protection, became a looming, indifferent mass. The horizon, familiar and constant when observed from deck, became an ever-changing landscape of peaks and troughs in the storm-tossed sea. Even the perception of direction failed, leaving the sailor to flail in a world where instinct and luck became the only determinants of survival. Panic surged through those who could not immediately find floating debris or support, accelerating the exhaustion of both mind and body. Breath became shallow and rapid, muscles cramped, and the ability to think or act rationally evaporated. Occasionally, a sailor could grab hold of floating material, a section of splintered hull, a dislodged oar, a barrel or crate torn free from the decks. These small victories could temporarily stave off death, offering a chance to rest and conserve energy. Yet such debris often carried its own dangers. Waves pushed and pulled it unpredictably, striking the body with force, pinning limbs, or tossing the survivor into collisions with other debris. More than once, sailors were caught under floating beams or trapped against wreckage, where the water that might have supported them instead became a tool of destruction. Holding on to such objects required not only physical strength, but constant attention and quick reflexes, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. Rescue was a rare possibility. In calmer seas, a nearby ship could attempt to approach a fallen sailor, throw a lifeline, or lower a small boat. In storm conditions, such efforts were almost always impossible. Even a single ship maneuvering to save a man risked collision with its own fleet, damage to its hull, or being driven onto rocks. Ships moved unpredictably in the waves, oars were difficult to synchronize, and the constant roar of wind and water made communication almost non-existent. Even when a fellow sailor saw a comrade struggling, the effort to save him might result in both being dragged under. Obedience to orders, once the key to survival, now ensured that no one would break formation to rescue a drowning man. Meanwhile, the storm continued its unrelenting assault. Waves rose higher, their crests breaking with tremendous force, crashing down on any head or limb that managed to stay above the surface. The water itself became a weapon, a living entity capable of holding a man underwater for long enough to induce panic, inhalation of seawater, and hypoxia. Each wave brought new disorientation. Each crash pulled swimmers further from safety, further from floating debris, and further from the awareness of where land, fleet, or safety might lie. The cumulative effect of repeated immersion, exhaustion, and disorientation was often instantaneous unconsciousness, followed by death. For those still conscious, the battle above was terrifying and incomprehensible. The sounds of shouting, splintering wood, and clashing oars created an auditory chaos that the brain could not parse. Visual cues were distorted by foam and spray, making it impossible to gauge distance or direction. Ships drifted past, sometimes colliding with the flailing bodies of men below. Others were hoisted against hulls, crushed or drawn under in the violent wake. The mind, deprived of context and certainty, began to succumb to fear. Even trained warriors, accustomed to combat and disciplined in formation, experienced overwhelming terror in these conditions. The sea reduced experience, skill, and courage to secondary concerns. Survival depended on instinct, strength, and a measure of luck almost impossible to achieve. Predation and secondary hazards added to the peril. Sharks, though not omnipresent, occasionally approached areas of concentrated human activity. Open wounds or blood in the water increased the likelihood of attack. More insidious were injuries sustained from the environment itself. Cuts from splintered wood, crushed fingers, bruised ribs, and cracked skulls. Minor injuries became catastrophic as exhaustion sapped the ability to swim or hold on to debris. Exposure compounded these threats. Even in Mediterranean waters, prolonged immersion led to hypothermia, shivering, and loss of coordination. Sailors could survive a few minutes in relative comfort. Hours were measured in relentless suffering, each moment reducing the probability of life. Time stretched endlessly. Seconds became minutes, minutes became hours, and yet the water offered no relief, no rhythm, no pattern. Floating survivors drifted, often unaware of their actual distance from land or fleet. Some clung to debris for hours, too exhausted to swim, too disoriented to navigate. Others were carried by currents far from the fleet, eventually washing ashore days later or disappearing entirely. The sea, in these conditions, was both judge and executioner, impartial and unyielding. The few survivors were marked permanently by the experience, eyes adjusted to the endless horizon. Hans remembered the unrelenting pressure of waves and debris. Muscles retained the memory of constant struggle. Even when rescued or reaching land, they often suffered long-term physical and psychological trauma, damaged limbs, chronic exposure injuries, and a mental imprint of terror that persisted for the rest of their lives. Ancient historians recount the horror in vivid detail. Witnesses described men clinging to floating wreckage, collapsing from exhaustion as the wind tore at their bodies, screaming into the void as help remained impossible. The horror was amplified by the understanding that the disaster could have been avoided had discretion been permitted, had orders allowed flexibility, had discipline not become a cage. The sea, in its indifference, made no distinctions. Rank, experience, bravery, or skill mattered little. Obedience to the fleet's order, which had once ensured survival, now ensured destruction. Every command given on deck that denied men autonomy in their response to environmental conditions translated directly into loss of life. Those who survived were the lucky, the strong, or the few who happened to find floating debris at the right moment, shielded from collisions or carried by the currents toward safety. Many more never had a chance. In the aftermath, ancient fleets learned grim lessons about human limitation, environmental unpredictability, and the deadly consequences of inflexible command. Rome, in particular, began to adapt naval strategy, loosening formations in dangerous conditions, granting more discretion to captains, and paying closer attention to seasonal patterns. These reforms were born of blood, as repeated disasters demonstrated the cost of strict adherence to doctrine over practical seamanship. However, the trauma for those who survived and for those who witnessed mass drownings endured across generations, shaping the way sailors understood the sea, their ships, and the fragile boundary between life and death at sea. This part of the story is not about glorious combat or heroic victory. It is about the relentless, impartial danger of the sea, magnified by human discipline, obedience, and the inexorable failure to respect forces beyond command. The men who survived this first trial were marked by endurance, but they were also haunted by the knowledge that thousands had perished not to enemy blades or rams, but to a combination of order obedience and the unyielding reality of the open sea. The struggle for survival in the water was measured in every possible domain: physical, mental, and moral. Physical endurance dictated whether a man could stay afloat, swim to debris, or fight exhaustion. Mental fortitude determined whether panic would consume rational thought, whether coordination could be maintained amidst chaos. Moral comprehension, in the sense of understanding the consequences of obedience and the limits of command, shaped memory and informed future behavior. Those who had once trusted discipline implicitly now knew the cost of absolute orders. They understood that at sea, flexibility was survival, and the rigid application of command could transform a fleet into a tomb. No sailor who had experienced this moment would ever look at the horizon the same way again. Every wave carried a reminder of helplessness. Every distant ship was a possible hazard or a potential rescue. The water, once a medium for strategy, movement, and victory, became an arena of terror and uncertainty, a domain where skill was necessary but not sufficient, where strength mattered but could not guarantee life, and where fortune remained the only impartial arbiter. The storm had passed, but the battle was far from over. For those who had survived the initial wreckage, the sea remained an unrelenting executioner. Every stroke of an arm, every desperate grasp for splintered timber, every gasp for breath was a reminder that the ocean was indifferent to heroism, rank, or training. The survivors were scattered, drifting among debris, some clinging to sections of broken hulls, others to oars or shields, their clothes and armor sodden, their strength eroding with each passing moment. Above them, the shattered remnants of their fleet moved unpredictably, some ships grounded, some barely afloat, and some lost entirely to the currents. The organized structures they had relied upon, the lines, the signals, the commands, no longer existed. In their place was chaos, absolute and indifferent. The first instinct of any sailor in such circumstances was to seek proximity to others. Humans are social creatures, conditioned to rely on cohesion, cooperation, and shared effort, and nowhere is that more true than on the decks of ancient warships. Alone, a sailor's chances of survival plummeted. Floating in isolation, buffeted by waves, exhausted and disoriented, even the most seasoned man faced a terrifying probability of death. The survivors instinctively sought each other, and in doing so, often encountered new hazards. Ships still partially afloat collided with drifting debris. Oars, twisted by broken timbers, struck men in the water. Pieces of mast snapped free and drifted like spears, threatening to crush anyone in their path. Even rescue became perilous, as the sea's random, violent motion made coordinated aid nearly impossible. Exposure added another layer of threat. The Mediterranean, though warmer than northern waters, offered little comfort in a storm. The combination of wet clothes, armor, and relentless wind drained body heat rapidly. Men experienced the slow, insidious onset of hypothermia long before exhaustion rendered them incapable of effective movement. Muscles stiffened, coordination failed, and swimming became less precise. Breathing became more labored, and panic, which had been manageable in brief intervals, now took root and spread. Panic in water is not merely psychological, it is a physiological phenomenon. Gasping for breath in waves that lift and slam the body repeatedly leads to rapid inhalation of water. Drowning not in deep seas, but in sudden miscalculations. Even experienced sailors, accustomed to discipline and rigorous training, found themselves at the mercy of forces that no skill could overcome. Injuries compounded the peril. The initial storm and collisions with other ships had left countless men with cuts, bruises, dislocations, and broken bones. Leather armor, once protective, became a liability. Helmets filled with water and dragged the head backward. Tunics, soaked and heavy, restricted movement and entangled limbs. Shields, swords, and oars, essential weapons on deck, were now weights, pulling men under, snagging them on debris, and cutting through flesh with each uncontrolled impact. Every movement required extraordinary effort, and yet even the effort itself could worsen injuries or create new ones. An arm trapped between two floating timbers could break with a single wave. A foot caught in twisted rope or canvas could be crushed. The sea, indifferent to pain or suffering, simply continued, relentless in its pressure, its motion, and its capacity for destruction. The mental strain was equally devastating. Sailors trained for coordinated maneuvers, for obedience to commands, and for collective effort were suddenly isolated. Their environment offered no cues for decision-making, no signals for direction, no reliable markers of distance or orientation. Each wave presented a new threat. Each splash could hide debris or a fellow human struggling for life. Survival depended entirely on improvisation, instinct, and physical capability. The very framework of discipline and order that had ensured their effectiveness now offered no guidance. The knowledge that their own commanders could not help them, and that adherence to prior orders was meaningless in this new context, weighed heavily on the psyche. Panic, when it emerged, was amplified by the understanding that there was no structure to rely on, no reinforcements coming, no predictable pattern to exploit. Currents and tides played a merciless role. Even men with significant swimming ability were carried away from floating wreckage, isolated from potential assistance, and toward open water. The Mediterranean may appear calm in maps and textbooks, but it is a complex system of shifting currents, wind-driven flows, and local eddies. In storm conditions, these forces became unpredictable and deadly. Survivors who thought they were moving towards safety could be carried backward, sideways, or into hazards such as rocks, shoals, or partially submerged wrecks. The sea's motion was deceptive, forcing the strongest and most experienced sailors into constant reassessment of direction, every decision a gamble with life itself. Some attempted to cling to larger pieces of wreckage, hoping to gain stability. Entire sections of hull, torn free from the main ships, offered temporary relief. But even this was treacherous. Waves lifted and threw debris unpredictably, tilting planks, breaking timbers, and pinning men underneath with crushing force. Survivors who initially found refuge were often thrown off by sudden surges, sometimes colliding violently with other debris or with fellow sailors. In addition, smaller floating pieces, shields, crates, oars, could strike like missiles, splitting skulls or cutting limbs. The constant risk of injury required an almost superhuman vigilance. The sea demanded awareness of multiple threats simultaneously: the immediate movement of one's own body, the position and trajectory of floating debris, the motion of nearby survivors, and the larger forces of wind and wave. Fatigue quickly diminished the ability to maintain this awareness, increasing the likelihood of mistakes and injury. Predation and biological hazards further exacerbated the danger. While large predators, such as sharks, were not omnipresent, the scent of blood in the water attracted attention. Cuts sustained during collisions with wreckage or fellow sailors could become sites of infection in warm salt water, and minor wounds that might have healed on land became life-threatening. Saltwater itself was corrosive to flesh, exacerbating abrasions, and constant immersion caused the skin to wrinkle, blister, and weaken. Exposure to sun and wind between waves, combined with cold water immersion, produced a combination of burns, hypothermia, and exhaustion that few could withstand for long. Even in the absence of external attack, the human body faced relentless pressure from these environmental hazards. Rescue, when attempted, often failed. Ships that remained partially afloat could not maneuver safely without risking collisions with debris or other vessels. Smaller boats, launched in an attempt to save drifting sailors, were frequently overturned or smashed by waves. Communication was nearly impossible. Voices were swallowed by wind and water, signals misread, and confusion amplified. Sailors who attempted to reach one another or aid those in immediate danger frequently became casualties themselves. The combination of waves, current, and panic created a self-perpetuating cycle of death, injury, and disorientation. Every rescue attempt could worsen the situation, and yet the instinct to help others compelled many to try, even when the likelihood of success was negligible. Time, in this environment, became almost meaningless. Hours passed like minutes, yet the strain on body and mind compounded continuously. Exhaustion manifested physically through trembling, cramping, and failure of motor coordination, and mentally through confusion, despair, and intermittent panic. Survivors who had managed to cling to wreckage or floating debris often drifted for hours, unable to determine direction, measure distance, or estimate safety. The unpredictability of the sea meant that every movement carried risk. Even the effort to maintain buoyancy or stabilize oneself on floating wreckage was exhausting, sometimes resulting in collapse or involuntary submersion. Some sailors, in moments of rare fortune, reached partial safety on shallow reefs, sandbanks, or small outcroppings of rock. Yet even these refuges were temporary. Waves broke unpredictably against these points, and the effort to maintain footing or clamber out required enormous strength. Others found themselves isolated from their fleet entirely, adrift with no contact or support. These men faced a prolonged struggle for survival, often stretching into hours or even a full day. Hunger, dehydration, hypothermia, and physical injury compounded the dangers they had already faced. Mental endurance became as important as physical strength, as despair could lead to mistakes or the simple surrender to the pull of the sea. In the historical record, these moments are recounted with grim precision. Ancient writers, chronicling the Roman naval disasters off the coasts of Sicily and North Africa, describe men who clung to floating timber for hours, slipping in and out of consciousness, surrounded by dead or dying comrades. They recount sailors who attempted to swim toward distant ships, only to be drawn away by unseen currents, colliding with debris or succumbing to exhaustion. The reports emphasize not only the scale of the disaster, but the relentless nature of the danger. The sea claimed life without discrimination, and no amount of skill or courage could guarantee survival. By the time some survivors were finally recovered, if indeed they were recovered, the psychological and physical toll was immense. Muscles were cramping and failing, skin was macerated, bruised, or cut. Hypothermia and exposure had reduced body function to near failure. Minds were flooded with sensory overload. The roar of wind and waves, the sight of bodies, the smell of salt water, blood, and decomposing matter, the constant motion threatening to undo every effort at stability. Those who lived often carried the trauma of this ordeal for the rest of their lives, marked by vivid memories of comrades lost, debris that became instruments of death, and the relentless pressure of forces beyond their control. No aspect of ancient naval warfare could be more brutally instructive than these moments. Combat at sea had always been dangerous, but the human mind had evolved to comprehend threats from enemy weapons. The unpredictability of the sea, coupled with rigid adherence to command and doctrine, created a category of danger that was entirely new, one in which discipline, skill, and courage could not prevent catastrophe. These survivors understood that in the water, survival depended on more than technique. It depended on endurance, instinct, situational awareness, and a degree of luck almost impossible to quantify. The survivors' stories, preserved in fragments by ancient historians, emphasize a universal truth of naval warfare that remains relevant across millennia. The greatest threats are not always external. The combination of human orders, rigid obedience, and natural forces can create devastation as complete as any engagement with enemy ships. The sea, impartial and indifferent, amplifies human error and transforms even minor miscalculations into catastrophes of epic scale. These lessons, learned through suffering and recorded through the testimony of survivors, shaped the evolution of naval strategy, command structure, and the cultural understanding of maritime risk in the ancient world. Even after reaching safety, survivors face the ongoing consequences of exposure. Saltwater burns, infections from minor wounds, and hypothermia often required days or weeks to recover. Psychological trauma persisted for years. Sleep was haunted by the sensation of waves, the sound of water rushing, and the memory of comrades swept away. The knowledge that many had died not in battle, but because of orders, because of an inflexible doctrine prioritizing formation over adaptation, created a lingering distrust of command, a deep awareness of the limits of obedience, and a profound respect for the uncontrollable forces of nature. The survivors who managed to cling to floating debris or shallow reefs did not find safety in the traditional sense. The sea, though temporarily less violent than during the initial storm, had not relinquished its dominance. Its movements remained unpredictable, and every moment of stillness was deceptive, a fleeting respite that could vanish with a single shift of wind or swell. For those who were still alive, survival had entered a new phase. The challenge was no longer simply to remain above water, but to maintain awareness, conserve energy, and navigate towards safety, all while dealing with the physical and psychological aftermath of the initial catastrophe. The first task of the survivors was to stabilize themselves. Even with floating timber, every movement required careful calculation. The sea's currents twisted and spun debris in ways that seemed almost deliberate, forcing sailors to anticipate motion while compensating for exhaustion and injury. A plank that had initially seemed secure could flip with the force of a wave, throwing a man into the water again. Oars, broken from the wreck, struck unpredictably. Shields and armor, once lifelines on the deck, became cumbersome weights in the water, and every attempt to remove them risked exhausting already depleted strength. Survival required a balance between movement and stillness. Too much activity could accelerate exhaustion. Too little could allow the sea to carry one into dangerous positions or collisions with debris and fellow survivors. Even more treacherous was the realization that the danger extended beyond the immediate water around them. The remnants of the fleet, still attempting to maintain any semblance of order, posed a constant hazard. Ships partially afloat, their hulls damaged and taking on water, drifted unpredictably in the waves. Crew members desperately tried to salvage what remained, but in doing so, they created new risks for the men in the water. A single misjudged maneuver could crush a survivor beneath a hull, pin him between floating timbers, or force him to dive under waves to avoid collision. In such moments, instinct often overrode training. Those who had once been disciplined Marines now made split-second choices driven by fear and desperation, choices that could mean life or death, not just for themselves, but for those around them. The physical toll on the survivors was immediate and severe. Muscles already fatigued by hours of swimming and treading water began to cramp and fail. Coordination deteriorated. Breathing became increasingly labored as the body struggled to maintain oxygen levels while simultaneously resisting cold water and stabilizing against moving debris. Minor injuries, cuts and bruises sustained during the initial wreck worsened rapidly. Saltwater inflamed wounds and caused relentless pain. Hypothermia crept insidiously, its onset slow but unrelenting, reducing core temperature, impairing judgment, and making every motion more taxing. Even the simplest tasks, holding onto a floating plank, turning to avoid a wave, lifting an arm to catch debris, required extraordinary exertion, and every action spent a finite reserve of energy that was rapidly running out. While the physical challenges were extreme, the psychological weight was equally crushing. The survivors were acutely aware of the scale of the disaster. They could see fellow sailors being tossed into the waves, crushed beneath timbers, or dragged under by exhaustion. Each loss was a visceral reminder of their own mortality. Panic, which had threatened during the initial moments of the storm, now emerged in more subtle but equally dangerous ways. Mental fatigue, disorientation, and fear combined to reduce situational awareness. Some survivors fixated on distant objects of potential safety, shores, reefs, or other floating debris, only to find that currents had carried them away before they could reach them. Others were consumed by the perception of imminent death, imagining themselves being dragged under at any moment, unable to act effectively even when opportunity presented itself. Rescue, when it arrived, was often chaotic and incomplete. Smaller boats launched from surviving ships or from partially grounded hulls could attempt to retrieve men from the water, but these efforts were fraught with danger. Waves could overturn a small craft, tossing rescuers and survivors alike into the sea. Debris could entangle oars or puncture hulls. Communication between boat and swimmer was difficult in the roar of wind and water. Even successful retrievals required the survivor to exert energy to grasp a line, lift themselves aboard, or hold steady while being hauled out of the water. Each attempt demanded coordination, strength, and timing, and failure often resulted in further injury or death. Ancient texts describe moments in which sailors were rescued only to immediately collapse from exhaustion, injured by debris, or incapacitated by hypothermia, highlighting that survival was never simple, even when help was present. Amidst the physical struggle, the survivors were forced to make rapid strategic decisions. They had to choose whether to attempt reaching shore, remain on drifting wreckage, or move toward the remnants of the fleet. Each choice carried profound risk. Approaching shore offered potential safety, but also the danger of hidden rocks, sudden shoals, or strong currents. Staying with debris increased the chance of drifting into open water or colliding with wreckage, but provided temporary flotation and the possibility of rescue by other survivors or ships. Attempting to rejoin the fleet could bring relative safety if the ships remained intact, but the chaotic aftermath of the storm meant that formations had broken, coordination was nearly impossible, and movement could be as deadly as remaining adrift. In every decision, the margin for error was vanishingly small, and the consequences of miscalculation were immediate and often fatal. The environment compounded these challenges. Waves remained unpredictable, rising and breaking in patterns that defied expectation. Wind-driven currents pushed survivors in directions they could not control. Rain, when it fell, added weight to clothing and armor, reduced visibility, and chilled the body further. Sun exposure between waves caused burns and dehydration, while salt water made even brief exposure painful and corrosive to skin. Every element of nature was amplified by the survivor's weakened state, transforming the ocean into a multi-dimensional threat in which the line between life and death was determined by the ability to constantly adapt and respond to shifting conditions. Injuries played an increasing role in shaping the fate of survivors. Even minor cuts became major threats as saltwater inflamed tissue, and continuous movement prevented healing. Broken bones or dislocated joints, sustained either in the initial storm or during the struggle in the water, rendered survivors unable to swim effectively, increasing the risk of being swept away. Fatigue amplified the impact of injuries. A man with a sprained ankle could no longer stabilize on debris. A sailor with a bruised shoulder could not hold himself upright against waves. In extreme cases, exhaustion and injury combined to produce a state in which survival was no longer possible, despite the individual's previous strength or skill. Interactions among survivors themselves introduced additional dangers. Human instinct drove them toward others, seeking the security and potential aid of a group, but in the chaotic environment of floating debris, close proximity could be deadly. Waves could toss one man into another, causing injury or submergence. Shared timber or floating structures could tip unpredictably, sending multiple men into the water simultaneously. Panic among one individual could create a ripple effect, destabilizing others nearby. The very attempt to cooperate or assist could inadvertently accelerate the likelihood of death, demonstrating the cruel paradox that survival sometimes required isolation even as instinct demanded cohesion. Time stretched into an unmeasurable continuum. Minutes became hours. Each wave carried the potential to end life or prolong it temporarily, creating an unending cycle of exertion, failure, and fleeting relief. The body's reserves dwindled steadily, each breath, stroke, or grasp consuming energy that could not be replenished. The mind, equally taxed, struggled to process sensory input, maintain direction, and manage fear. Sleep, if it came at all, was impossible, for to doze was to surrender to the pull of the sea, Consciousness became an act of defiance, a fragile barrier between life and drowning. The survivor's ordeal was compounded by environmental hazards beyond immediate perception. Submerged wreckage, invisible beneath the waves, threatened entanglement or injury. Sharp fragments of broken wood, metal fittings, and splintered oars punctured flesh or snagged clothing, creating pain, distraction, and additional weight. The water itself, heavy with salt and debris, resisted movement, sapping strength with every stroke. Even the act of breathing, simple in theory, required constant adjustment to avoid inhaling water, maintain stability, and stay aligned with debris or other survivors. As hours passed, the odds of survival declined exponentially. Only those with exceptional endurance, acute situational awareness, and a measure of luck remained afloat. The physical, psychological, and environmental pressures combined into an unrelenting challenge that few could withstand indefinitely. Historical accounts describe survivors who drifted for hours, sometimes over vast distances, before reaching land or being rescued by partial remnants of the fleet. Many did not survive long enough for even the smallest measure of aid to reach them. The casualties were immense, and the scale of human suffering unmatched by the immediacy of combat with enemy fleets. By the time daylight gave way to the approaching night, exhaustion had reached critical levels. Muscles failed, limbs trembled uncontrollably, and consciousness wavered. Those who had relied on floating debris were at risk of slipping into open water. Waves, continuing their unpredictable assault, became increasingly dangerous as energy reserves diminished. Survivors faced the dual challenge of maintaining buoyancy and avoiding injury while simultaneously remaining vigilant against shifting wreckage, currents, and other survivors whose movements might inadvertently imperil them. The sea demanded constant attention, and failure meant instant death. The psychological consequences of this prolonged exposure were profound. Survivors were haunted not only by the immediate threats to their lives, but by the memory of comrades lost, the knowledge that orders had failed them, and the realization that survival depended on factors beyond training or discipline. Fear, exhaustion, and despair interacted in complex ways, affecting judgment and reducing the capacity for effective action. The trauma of seeing friends and fellow sailors drowned, crushed, or incapacitated intensified the mental strain, creating a situation in which cognitive performance was as crucial to survival as physical ability. Even when rescue or landfall was finally achieved, the ordeal left permanent effects. Muscles remained weak, often failing days later under stress. Injuries sustained during hours adrift were exacerbated or complicated. Skin and tissue, damaged by prolonged exposure to salt water, cold, and friction, required extended recovery. The mind retained vivid memories of chaos, fear, and helplessness, shaping the survivor's perception of the sea, naval discipline, and the consequences of rigid command. These lessons, though learned in agony, informed future naval operations, influencing doctrine, training, and the gradual evolution of maritime strategy in the ancient world. As the survivors of the storm and wreckage clung to their floating timber, battered shields, or fragments of shattered hull, the remnants of the fleet began to regain some semblance of motion. The rigid lines that had once defined formations had long since dissolved into chaotic dispersal, yet commanders, desperate to salvage what remained, attempted to rally their vessels. Flags were raised, voices shouted across the waves, and signals were made with oars and sails, but the environment was no longer responsive to coordination. Ships, now waterlogged and damaged, responded unpredictably to wind and current. Even small corrections in course could produce violent collisions, tearing hulls and decks further apart. Every movement carried the dual potential for rescue and destruction. The sailors who had survived the initial immersion now faced a new and paradoxical danger. The very ships, that might save them threatened to destroy them. A vessel attempting to approach a man clinging to debris risked crushing him against floating wreckage, trapping him beneath timbers, or overturning in the turbulent water. Waves lifted hulls unpredictably, and in the confusion, it was often impossible to judge whether the line between rescue and death had been crossed. Those still in the water had to make instantaneous life or death decisions. Attempting to grab a rope could pull one under if the ship's movement was misjudged. Reaching for a hand extended from the deck might result in collision with a submerged beam or a fellow struggling survivor. The same force that could lift a sailor from the water could also break him, leaving no room for error. As the day wore on, exhaustion had begun to claim survivors systematically. Even the strongest and most disciplined rowers were now weakened by hours of continuous struggle, hypothermia, and physical injuries. Hands blistered from gripping rough timber, arms trembling from the effort of keeping heads above water, and legs numb from constant tension signaled that energy reserves were nearly depleted. Fatigue reduced coordination, making the simplest action, turning a wrist, lifting an arm, adjusting posture, an immense struggle. Mental faculties deteriorated alongside the body's capabilities. Attention waned, decision-making faltered, panic surged more easily. In these conditions, the ocean required constant vigilance. A single moment of lapse could mean being pulled beneath a wave, colliding fatally with debris, or drifting irretrievably away from potential rescue. In addition to these human factors, the environment posed escalating hazards. Waves remained unpredictable and powerful, throwing survivors into new collisions and separating them from temporary safe havens. Wind-driven currents carried individuals away from both land and fleet remnants. Water temperature, though moderate by Mediterranean standards, was sufficient to accelerate hypothermia over prolonged exposure, particularly in men already weakened by physical exertion. Debris, once a source of temporary safety, became an unstable battleground as waves lifted and tossed sections of hull unpredictably. Splintered oars, broken masts, and jagged planking created constant threats of lacerations and puncture wounds, which, combined with prolonged immersion, could rapidly become life-threatening. The sea had transformed the survivors' environment into a multidimensional hazard zone, where every movement carried multiple, simultaneous risks. The arrival of partially intact vessels introduced both hope and terror. Ships that had weathered the storm retained some maneuverability and were capable of attempting rescues. Commanders ordered their crews to locate survivors, throwing lines and launching small boats to retrieve those clinging to debris. But coordination in such conditions was extremely difficult. Waves could tip rescue boats instantly, currents carried lines out of reach, and flailing survivors often obstructed one another. Even successful rescue required enormous physical effort. Survivors had to grasp lines, climb aboard precarious craft, and maintain balance as the vessels rocked in unpredictable swells. A single misstep could result in resubmersion, injury, or being trapped beneath the hull. The margin for error was infinitesimal. The survivors themselves became aware that the presence of ships, while potentially life-saving, also demanded constant adaptation. One wrong motion could draw a vessel into deadly proximity, crush limbs between floating debris and hull, or entangle clothing and armor. Each attempt to signal, reach, or grasp a rescuing hand involved careful judgment, coordination, and an assessment of risks that were impossible to calculate precisely in turbulent conditions. For many, rescue was an act of simultaneous courage, skill, and pure fortune. Meanwhile, physical injuries continued to accumulate and compound the threat. Cuts, bruises, and punctures sustained during the storm, collisions with debris, and struggles in the water worsened over time. Salt water inflamed wounds, while constant motion prevented any meaningful healing. Hypothermia became more pronounced, weakening muscles and slowing cognitive response. Exhaustion undermined the ability to perform essential survival functions such as gripping debris, swimming short distances, or maintaining balance on unstable objects. The combination of prior trauma, ongoing physical challenge, and environmental stress created a scenario in which only extraordinary endurance could ensure survival. Survivors also faced the profound challenge of managing their own psychological states amidst these dangers. Prolonged exposure to mortal threat caused fear, despair, and disorientation to intensify. The mental strain was relentless, as each decision, when to swim, when to rest, which debris to grasp, carried immediate and potentially fatal consequences. Witnessing the suffering of others intensified the emotional burden. Sailors saw comrades dragged under, flailed by waves, or crushed beneath floating wreckage. This trauma compounded their own fatigue and confusion, reducing the capacity for rational decision-making and increasing the likelihood of panic, which in turn heightened the physical risk of drowning. Interactions among survivors became a complex mixture of cooperation and danger. Clustering near floating debris could provide mutual support, allowing men to stabilize one another, share the load of heavy timbers, and assist in signaling for help. Yet the same proximity could also produce lethal collisions, entanglements, or competitive struggles for limited resources. Waves could slam multiple individuals into each other, causing injury or submersion. Attempts to climb onto debris occupied by another survivor often resulted in both being thrown into the water. The sea's motion amplified human error, and even small mistakes could have immediate fatal consequences. Cooperation was necessary but fraught with risk, requiring constant vigilance and extraordinary judgment under extreme pressure. Amid these compounded challenges, some survivors attempted to swim toward recognizable landmarks or the distant outlines of ships. This introduced new layers of risk. Strong currents could carry a swimmer off course. Waves could separate him from the object of his effort, and physical exhaustion could make every stroke a fight against inevitable failure. Each movement demanded energy that was already dangerously depleted. Misjudgment could result in missing a lifeline, drifting further into open water, or exhausting oneself to the point of collapse. Many sailors, despite considerable skill and prior experience, succumbed to the combined effects of fatigue, disorientation, and environmental pressure while attempting such maneuvers. Time continued to stretch into a continuous, oppressive trial. The survivors were forced to maintain constant awareness and exertion for hours, often without relief. Every wave, every gust of wind, every shift in debris demanded attention and response. Physical endurance and cognitive function were taxed to their limits, and even minor miscalculations had catastrophic consequences. The line between life and death became increasingly narrow, and only those with exceptional resilience, skill, and luck were able to persist. Historical accounts underscore the scale and severity of such experiences. Chroniclers of ancient naval disasters describe sailors clinging to wreckage for hours, witnessing the death of comrades, enduring exposure and injury, and experiencing profound psychological stress. These reports emphasize not only the physical challenges of survival, but the relentless cruelty of the sea when human orders and discipline are rendered irrelevant by natural forces. Survivors often reported a lingering awareness of the sea's power, a recognition of the unpredictable danger of both environmental conditions and human error, and an enduring respect for the fragility of life in such circumstances. Rescue attempts by partially intact ships were heroic, yet imperfect. Sailors risked their lives to throw lines, launch boats, or maneuver vessels close enough to lift survivors from the water. Every success was hard-won and required coordination between rescuers and those being saved. Failures were common, sometimes resulting in additional casualties among the rescuers themselves. The survivors who were finally brought aboard were often too weak, injured, or traumatized to remain upright without assistance. Even once back on deck, the ordeal was far from over. They faced the immediate need to treat injuries, remove waterlogged clothing and armor, and combat the physiological effects of prolonged immersion and exhaustion. By late afternoon, some survivors had reached the relative safety of beaches or shallow reefs. Yet even there, the threat was not entirely removed. Waves continued to crash unpredictably. Rocks and debris threatened to inflict further injury, and exposure continued to drain energy. Those on land had to summon the strength to reach true shelter, tend to injuries, and recover while remaining vigilant against the residual dangers of the surrounding environment. For many, even reaching land represented only a partial victory. Survival was a process, not a moment, and the memory of the ocean's relentless assault remained vivid, shaping future behavior and awareness. The broader consequence of this phase of the disaster was the brutal lesson it delivered about the limits of human endurance and command at sea. Ancient naval fleets depended on discipline, coordination, and strict adherence to orders, yet these principles could not override the forces of nature. The combination of environmental hazards, physical exhaustion, injury, and psychological trauma demonstrated that survival was contingent not merely on skill or obedience, but on adaptability, quick judgment, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. This understanding reshaped naval doctrine in subsequent years, as fleets sought to balance discipline with flexibility, recognizing that rigid formation in the face of natural forces could be fatal. The night descended over the survivors like a shroud, thick and oppressive, transforming the already perilous environment into a realm of near-total uncertainty. The chaos of the storm had passed, yet the sea retained its dominance, a force utterly indifferent to human struggle. Darkness magnified every danger. Waves became indistinguishable from the void, floating debris merged with shadows, and distant ships, once potential lifelines, were now silhouettes that could as easily crush as rescue. Those still afloat were reduced to the barest essentials of survival, fighting against exhaustion, hypothermia, injury, and fear in a vast and unrelenting expanse of water. Physical exhaustion had by now claimed nearly all the survivors who had endured the day. Arms and legs that had once propelled men through the chaos of waves and debris were now trembling, unresponsive, or locked in cramp. Every breath required conscious effort. Every movement, no matter how slight, drew deeply on dwindling energy reserves. The prolonged struggle against cold, the constant demand to stabilize against shifting wreckage, and the effort required to maintain consciousness had pushed the human body to its absolute limits. Many who had survived the day now faced the cruel reality that the hours ahead might be even more lethal than the first, as fatigue compounded every other threat. Hypothermia became a subtle yet deadly presence. In the Mediterranean, even relatively temperate waters lose their warmth over prolonged exposure, especially when soaked clothing, waterlogged armor, and persistent wind act to draw heat from the body. The initial shivering that warned of cold had progressed to muscular stiffness, slowed reflexes, and clouded mental clarity. Survivors struggled to understand or even respond to environmental cues. A wave that would have been manageable earlier could now sweep a man under. Simple tasks such as gripping a plank or lifting an arm toward a lifeline became exercises in impossible endurance. Consciousness itself became a fragile barrier against the sea, and for many, the line between wakefulness and oblivion narrowed with every passing minute. Injuries sustained during the storm, collisions with debris, and previous rescue attempts now reached critical levels. Salt water inflamed every cut and abrasion, intensifying pain and accelerating blood loss. Broken or dislocated bones hindered swimming or stabilizing on debris, while bruised or cracked ribs made inhalation a laborious act. Wounds became gateways for infection even before rescue, exacerbated by continuous immersion in water teeming with microorganisms. Every survivor was a living testament to the cumulative impact of physical trauma, environment, and exhaustion, and each movement risked further damage, making survival increasingly precarious. The psychological dimension of this night was equally relentless. Darkness magnified fear, disorientation, and despair. The absence of light eliminated visual cues for orientation, forcing survivors to rely entirely on instinct, memory, and touch. The roar of waves became a monolithic soundscape masking the motion of floating wreckage and fellow survivors, while the occasional distant crash of a ship, essay hull, or masts striking waves served as constant reminders of death surrounding them. Sleep was impossible, and even rest required maintaining vigilance against the unpredictable motion of water and debris. Panic, which had intermittently threatened during daylight, now became a near-constant companion, fueled by isolation, exhaustion, and the unyielding awareness of mortality. Those few survivors who attempted to move toward remaining ships or distant shores faced a gauntlet of compounding hazards. Currents carried them unpredictably, sometimes in the wrong direction, or into perilous waters filled with jagged rocks, submerged wreckage, or treacherous shoals. Waves could throw them against debris or each other, causing injury or submersion. Physical exhaustion made each stroke more perilous, and miscalculation could result in instant incapacitation. Survival required the perfect balance of energy conservation, situational awareness, and timing, all while contending with a sea that had become both adversary and arbiter, impartial yet unyielding. Predation, though not constant, introduced another layer of fear. The scent of blood and motion in the water attracted marine predators. Sharks, though not omnipresent in the Mediterranean, occasionally patrolled areas of concentrated human activity. Injuries sustained during the day, combined with bleeding from minor wounds, created increased risk for attack. Every flail, every desperate grasp, every struggle for floating debris became not only a fight for stability, but potentially a fight against a lurking predator. The ocean's dangers were multifaceted, merging the physical, environmental, and biological into an omnipresent threat that required continuous adaptation and vigilance. The remnants of the fleet, for their part, continued attempts at salvage and rescue, yet the night made these efforts extraordinarily perilous. Ships partially afloat struggled against waves and wind, unable to maneuver with precision. Attempts to throw lines or launch boats risked immediate overturning or collision with debris. Every successful rescue required coordinated effort, one hand extended at the precise moment, one rope grasped with timing, one balance maintained as the vessel rolled unpredictably. For every success, the sea claimed multiple failures, drowned men, injured rescuers, and floating wreckage that compounded the chaos. Survival depended not only on endurance, but on extraordinary timing and fortune. Human interaction in the water continued to be a double-edged sword. Survivors instinctively sought the safety of proximity, clinging to shared debris or attempting to assist one another. Yet in the dark and storm-tossed environment, such cooperation was perilous. Waves could slam men into each other or into the debris they clung to, creating crushing forces that even the strongest could not resist. The movement of one could destabilize others. Panic among one individual often propagated through the group, destabilizing multiple men simultaneously. The line between aid and harm was invisible, and every cooperative action carried inherent risk. Time stretched into a continuous ordeal of endurance. Minutes lost their meaning. Hours became a relentless test of stamina, awareness, and mental fortitude. Each wave, each gust of wind, each shifting plank required a response, and failure was immediate and often fatal. The cumulative effects of exposure, injury, and fatigue created a scenario in which survival was no longer a matter of skill alone, but a combination of instinct, judgment, resilience, and chance. Historical accounts describe survivors who drifted through the night, clinging to debris for hours, witnessing repeated deaths around them, and experiencing an unending succession of near misses that tested both body and mind. The dawn, when it finally arrived, revealed a landscape of devastation. Ships were shattered or lost entirely, debris littered the surface of the sea, and the number of survivors had dwindled drastically. Those who had endured the night were marked permanently by the ordeal. Muscles were weak, bodies battered, and minds haunted by the events they had witnessed. Every scratch, bruise, and wound told a story of struggle, and every survivor carried the psychological imprint of relentless exposure, disorientation, and fear. The sea had exacted its toll, claiming the majority of those caught in the storm and leaving only the most resilient or fortunate to recount the disaster. Even once ashore, the survivors faced ongoing challenges. Injuries required treatment, waterlogged clothing and armor had to be removed, and exposure-induced hypothermia needed careful management. The psychological scars persisted far longer than physical injuries. Survivors recalled with vivid clarity the chaos of the water, the cries of drowning men, the crushing weight of debris, and the unrelenting pull of the sea. These memories shaped their perception of naval operations, discipline, and survival at sea for the remainder of their lives. Ancient historians documented these experiences not merely as accounts of disaster, but as lessons in human endurance, the limits of command, and the impartial, omnipotent force of the sea. From a strategic perspective, the disaster influenced naval doctrine in profound ways. Commanders recognized that rigid adherence to formation, discipline, and orders could lead to mass casualties when confronted with natural forces beyond their control. Future fleets began to consider environmental conditions, the limitations of human endurance, and the necessity of flexibility in command. The lessons of survival, chaos, and improvisation became integral to naval strategy, reflecting the hard-earned knowledge that victory and survival depended as much on understanding the sea as on defeating the enemy. The stories of those who survived this final night informed generations, shaping the maritime consciousness of empires and seafarers alike. The final ordeal also underscored the impartiality of the ocean as an adversary. Unlike enemy fleets, it did not distinguish between valorous and cowardly, high-ranking officers and rowers, experienced veterans and novices. All were subject to the same rules: fatigue, hypothermia, injury, disorientation, and death. Survival required extraordinary resilience, but even extraordinary effort did not guarantee safety. The sea was a relentless, indifferent judge, its verdict rendered without warning, negotiation, or exception. Those few who lived to see land or be rescued owed their survival to a combination of endurance, situational awareness, and fortune, the cruel calculus of existence at sea. As the survivors finally emerged from the water, ashore, or aboard ships that had endured, they carried the physical and psychological remnants of the catastrophe. Limbs were bruised and stiff, skin macerated, wounds inflamed. Minds were haunted by the vivid recollection of comrades lost, the chaos of the storm, and the unrelenting pressure of survival against impossible odds. The lessons learned were brutal but instructive. Obedience could not guarantee life, skill could not override the force of nature, and survival demanded adaptability, instinct, and extraordinary resilience. The stories of these survivors became both testimony and warning, preserving a record of the deadly interplay between human endeavor and the immense, impartial power of the sea. In conclusion, the last night of the survivors' ordeal exemplifies the ultimate test of endurance, skill, and psychological fortitude in ancient naval disasters. The sea, indifferent to human plans, discipline, and courage, demanded absolute resilience. Every wave, every gust of wind, every piece of debris presented a life or death challenge. Human effort, no matter how disciplined or skillful, was only effective when coupled with adaptability, timing, and an extraordinary degree of fortune. Those who survived did so not because of training alone, not because of obedience alone, but because they were able to navigate the chaotic interplay of environment, injury, fatigue, and human interaction, often against overwhelming odds. Their experiences offer timeless lessons in survival at sea, that the ocean is both adversary and arbiter, that human endurance has limits, and that the boundary between life and death can be measured not in strategy or valor, but in seconds, inches, and sheer persistence against forces beyond comprehension.